listening to the Virtual CISO Podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Already. Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. With you, as always, your host, John Verry, and with me today, two faces that probably look a little familiar, Warren Hylton and Jeff Carden. Hey, gentlemen.
Hello.
And I did use that term loosely. Despite the fact you guys are multi-time, welcome and congratulations for being multi-time guests. Tell us, why don't you each tell us just a brief amount about who you are and what it is you do every day.
Sure.
Jeff?
So I'm Jeff Carden. I work as a compliance consultant. I'm primarily focused on businesses that are subject to FAR, DFARs, NIST, and CMMC requirements, which is in the hundreds of thousands, as we know. I've got 20 plus years background working with the DIB, commercial manufacturing spaces as an IT infrastructure manager. And I also do a little bit of ISO work. And my goal is pretty simple when it comes to interactions with companies. It's to help them navigate all the intricacies and vague language that we're familiar with when it comes to the U.S. government.
Yeah. Well, my name is Warren Hylton. I come out of the managed IT service provider space. That was where I first found out about cybersecurity compliance and the whole world of federal contracting, really. And so I've been working with NIST 800-171 and CMMC implementations for a number of years now. Enjoy the time that we're in now, where I get to do a lot more readiness reviews, as we call them, kind of mock CMMC assessments. So while it is very enjoyable to implement these controls and implement a security program, it's really nice now that we get an opportunity to work with folks that say, here it is, and how'd we do? So all spectrums of the CMMC program and assessment, very enjoyable. And other things I like to do are our exercises for business continuity and incident response. So tabletop exercises, should really enjoy leading those. So those are a lot of fun. Getting involved with different companies other than defense contractors or federal contractors. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me and my background here.
Cool, thank you. So this is where I usually ask you what you drink, and we've already been through that. I will just throw something out there. For Christmas, my daughter and son got me a collection of bourbon barrel aged stouts from a brewery out in New York that I think is just outstanding, called Finback. I would highly recommend to anyone out there, if you ever see a Finback, any of their BQA series, they are outrageously good. Expensive, maybe a 16-ounce bottle's in the $25-$30 range, but some of the best beers you've ever had. I mean, if you guys use Untapped at all, they're
awesome.
around 4 or 5, which is you see anything above 4, you're in pretty good shape. 4.2, anything above 4.2 is usually just, wow, this is ridiculously good. 4.5 is legendary, and their beers are. So if you get a chance. All right, so that's not why we're here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm here, maybe, to talk about Finback and beer, but that's not why you guys are here. You guys are here to talk about your favorite subject, CMMC. So on 12/26, it finally happened. The DOD published the much anticipated rule for the, as they refer it, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. Your thoughts, right, working every day, how did the industry and your clients react? Was it relief? Was it excitement? Was it, and then I would also ask is, did it differ for those organizations that are seeking certification versus other people in the ecosystem that you interact with?
Yeah. So,
Jeff?
First and foremost, me personally was very happy that we got the final rule. And we've been in this kind of CMMC ready state, both with version 1 and version 2 for a couple of years, if not longer. And so now we have that kind of target date for implementation. And I think across the spectrum of the businesses that I work with was relief, because there was not a 0% chance that the program was going to fall through leading up until that announcement. There was talk that they could just fold it up into something else. But across the board with the clients that I'm dealing with, it's relief. Again, we have that target date. We have the clarification. And the folks that we're dealing with mostly have taken this thing very seriously, right? So they're well along the journey, and they're not up against these kind of ridiculous timeframes that a company or an entity that hasn't really gotten serious about it is now up against. So I think the reaction was very positive. They're very happy about it, even though we know with some of the language that there's a little bit of uncertainty and we have some additional questions that have now popped. The reaction has been very good.
Yeah, I think that also is in the people that are helping companies implement these controls, and also the C3PAOs that are going to do the assessments. I mean, there was a possibility that this thing could have been dropped in a interim final rule, and we got 90 days. And I mean, thinking about tens of thousands of assessments in this calendar year, I think really gave pause to a lot of C3PAOs. So the idea that this is coming out in more of a methodical time frame that actually gives a ramp up period for assessments, I can say that C3PAOs definitely have relief to as well, that it's not something that's just being jammed on them, but it's something that they get to kind of scale up to as we head towards 2025. So relief all across the board.
You guys live in it every day. I live in it sometimes. So, from my review of the documentation, I thought the good news was it's pretty much what we expected, right? It hasn't varied that much. It's been pretty consistent. I thought it was interesting. They went into a little bit more detail about the overall structure of the program. I've seen the term now used by people called the CMMC Assessment and Certification Ecosystem, which I thought was interesting and actually well stated, right? Because it is truly an ecosystem. The other thing which was amazing was that they have the 68 new acronyms that they defined in the proposed rule. When you guys kind of reviewed it, did you see anything that you found surprising?
Right. So we live in a TLA FLA world, right? 3-letter acronym, 4-letter acronym. So more acronyms is just par for the course, to use a golf analogy.
They get paid. I think they
do.
Get paid by the acronyms down there.
Interesting
that lines up.
that now CUI is called CUI, which for me is another a head-scratching moment. So, but when it comes to this particular facet of the announcement, one thing that kind of struck me when it comes to this new nomenclature was this notion of an ESP, and it did intrigue me, of this external service provider that kind of popped out. So it's not a cloud service provider, it's not necessarily a managed service or managed security services provider, but it is now it's an attribute for an entity that a company is doing business with, that now they have to rationalize this interaction with. Is it a third-party risk management type of thing that they have to look at? And I found that that language was very intriguing, and I believe too, looking at some of the comments and questions and that I've entertained with our clients, and also anecdotally in the ecosystem, is very much percolating up to the top of one of the things that they're wanting more clarification on.
Yeah, I would say too that it kind of reminded me of the CMMC 1.0 days, because when that was originally announced, it was very much this ecosystem, this program, and here's going to be these people doing these things and these organizations doing these things, and they're all working together for this common objective. And then 2.0 came out, and 2.0 was more like we gotta do something right now mid-flight. It was kind of it didn't feel like it had the full organization of the original. This is the model. This is how things will go. And then now we're kind of back to that original where everything is very clear. Like Jeff said, acronyms galore, but they're not really acronyms that we shouldn't be completely unfamiliar with. But I do like to see kind of the complete picture that we see here now in the final rule, because it does remind me a lot of how this thing kind of rolled out, where there would be an ecosystem and there would be this part doing that and this part doing this. And so I think we're kind of like full circle back to that. And but I really like the fullness of the final picture here.
Yeah, I think one was the ecosystem. Two was, revisiting the standard, if you will, and just saying, hey guys, we're going to dial this back. Maybe we got out a little over our ski tips. Yep. We already have 800-171. Yep. Let's just use that, right? And the associated documents. So yeah, I agree with that. And that's actually a good lead into the next question I had for you guys. speaking about 171 and 172 and 171A and all those wonderful documents, I thought it was interesting that the rule explicitly listed 16 other cyber publications, standards, guidelines, whatever we want to call them, to be used and quote unquote understood by contractors. So I was curious as, when you looked at that list, were there any surprises? And does that open the door for a little bit more auditor discretion of interpreting a particular requirement?
Well, I would say that I think it definitely does open the door for what the auditors can tap into, because I think to date, when you look at NIST 800-171, it is, we got to remember that that's the tailored version of what the security baseline should be. So a lot was removed to get to 800-171. So if you saw 800-171 as this like standalone document and it just kind of was this random thing that lived on its own, then you kind of missed the picture anyways from the beginning. So all these other special publications in that series, the 800 series, are very helpful when you're trying to interpret what an 800-170 control is really getting at. So I do like that they've introduced those and specify them. That way, an OSC will be able to see that before an assessor says, well, let's open up another special publication to answer some specific questions we're talking about. So I think that was great. And then the other thing that I really found interesting was the ISO standards that were called out, because they were ones relating to accreditation body and sort of certification process. And that was something that, again, going back years ago, that was something that the CMMC AB, the now Cyber AB, always knew they had to do certain things so that way they could be an accredited accreditation body. And so the fact that those standards are also called out, I think is really interesting, because that to me means that the accreditation body is aligning around a standard as well, as far as how they will go through the certification process. So there's a lot of talk about reciprocity between standards and certifications in information security space. And I think the fact that the accreditation body is going full on with the ISO standards for the accreditation body and certifications themselves, I think is hopefully over the long haul could actually do a lot to allow reciprocity between that standard and others. So I'm very happy to see those three called out too as well.
Yeah, I think that the argument for reciprocity and the conversations that have already taken place about that, I think we all look at this naturally and think like one of the most logical reciprocities would be FedRAMP, right? If you're already FedRAMP ATO'd, right, I think we would all agree that a FedRAMP ATO, especially to moderate or high, is a little bit more exacting than just a NIST 800-171 level 2, right? So it would logically be that. This idea of there being some either reciprocity or at least some formula for integration, if you will, between ISO and CMMC makes a lot of sense, right? So a lot of the companies that we're working with currently, right, have traditionally been ISO 27001 certified at the request of either a government agency or from a commercial space. They need to maintain that commercial ISO 27001 certification, but now based on this new requirement, they're trying to do CMMC. And this idea of running these two programs concurrently, as an example, maybe you're running your ISO 27001 ISMS with CMMC as an input into it. I think, like you said, they're opening the door to that, which I think is important and necessary, right?
Absolutely.
Jeff, what were your thoughts in looking at the standards and the guidelines? And
yeah, so I think Warren
hit
the nail on the head there. So we're adding to the specificity of the program. The more information that we have, whether it's spread out over multiple documents or kind of condensed down into one, is not really the point. It's the fact that we have this library of information that helps us paint the picture of what the requirement is asking for, and how to assess against it, how to scope all of the questions around the whole process. And yes, you may have to go to different documents to get the answer, but it's there, and they're providing that in the context of having a clearer picture of it. And as far as that kind of crosswalk of the standards, absolutely, it's important, because if you look at ISO and you read some of the language, it's very similar language. And having assessed both sides of that, ISO and CMMC and NIST, the assessment process is very similar. So why wouldn't you give some credit or, leverage that overlap to the betterment of not only the company, but also the ecosystems that each one is representing? ISO, which has its benefits, CMMC has its, and basically, provide, I hate to use the term, the synergy between the two, but that's essentially what you're doing, is you're piggybacking off of one versus the other, and you're providing, you're reducing that duplicative work sometimes that can be a little, taxing on organizations.
Yeah, the other thing too is that, I find that when you look at where well-run cybersecurity programs occasionally break down, it's in that operational component, right? And anything we can do to simplify and automate operations is better. So not having disparate forms of guidance or not needing to implement a control with a tweak for one versus the other, right? The more they can be homogenized, I think the easier it is to run your cybersecurity program, which yields a net effective, more secure organization.
Yep.
Oh, interesting. So getting down to a little bit of brass tacks here, right? So were there any changes to the requirements for the 3 levels or the attestation approach for each of them? So is it, and then I'll ask that question, then I'll ask you a question about level 3 as well.
Sure.
So I did not see that. I think that was the 2.0 update. The 2.0 update righted that ship, and then now with the final rule here, we're just kind of building on what should have really been followed from the beginning. So 800-171 is the law of the land. I did find it interesting that revision 2 of 800-171 is called out in here. So it's not just NIST special publication 800-171, specified revision 2 in the final rule, which is really helpful for contractors looking for guidance on the revision 3 that's coming. But by and large, I think they just kind of continued the right step that they took when the 2.0 walked things back to just using the NIST standards.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of jumped out for me that, and I've been a part of this dynamic before in a previous life, is there was I think that the slight tweak to it where they're now asking for attestation by company principal, even during those maintenance years. And that attestation and that notary type of exercise is now going into a public system of record for the U.S. government. So it's putting the skin in the game, right? And I've been a part of those conversations where, there's question of whether or not you're truly implementing something or you're truly compliant to something. And then when you ask somebody to sign something, all of a sudden it's like, I'm not signing this because there's not a consensus among all of the parties internally that they're actually meeting it. So this will drive those internal conversations to make sure that when you say that you're meeting a particular control or a compliance standard, that you're truly doing it. Before a company principal is going to sign off on that, they're going to want to make sure that all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted and that they understand as well. So there's none of this kind of gray area, I think, because again, that now we have skin in the game. And so I like that that approach because I think the rumblings we're seeing in the program that the False Claim Act is now, that's being brought back into our discussion, that it could be they could be leveraging that hammer a little bit more going forward.
Did they literally? I saw the signature by a senior authorizing official, or they used some official term. Did they actually?
Well,
say
I
that
say
had to be a
notarized,
statement?
but by virtue of the fact that it's going into SPRS, I think is kind of what I'm alluding to. It's basically somebody's going to sign it.
Sort of that formality. Okay. Yeah, and listen, and for anyone who doesn't think that changes things, I'd point you to Sarbanes-Oxley 404 attestation, right? That when you got to a point where suddenly, after Enron, with Sarbanes-Oxley spun up, and suddenly you were going to, a senior, chief audit officer, or you're going to a CFO, and you're saying, hey, you need to sign off on the control environment around these financials.
Yeah.
That meant something, right? Suddenly they were like, hold on a second. I need to see some evidence that this stuff is actually running. So that's an interesting question. Like, one of the concerns that I had with a triennial, if that's the right way to say, every third year audit, right, is that you don't have those touch points. So I think that the signatory component will help. Is your expectation that in order for a senior official to sign off, that they're going to be looking for some form of evidence? Like I know if I was asked to sign off on something, I'd want to have a basis for my opinion. I'd probably want to have somebody present me the evidence. Ideally, independent, objective, third-party evidence. Do you think that much the same way in ISO, right? We do internal ISMS audits each year to validate the effectiveness and present that data to the registrar. Do you think that that's going to drive quote unquote CMMC internal audit or CMMC validation assessments in the interim years?
I believe absolutely, yeah.
I think.
Go ahead, Warren.
Yeah. I think that was a great parallel too, the ISO internal audits being performed by an objective third party, because sometimes that internal audit becomes a misnomer of, well, it's got to be an internal resource. Well, no, it just needs to be an audit accepted internally, not externally. So, yeah, I think absolutely that's a great parallel. And I think at the end of the day, though, unfortunately, it's going to come down to particular executives and their risk tolerances. But I think anybody, like you said, that is thinking that through, what they're about to sign, what they're about to attest to, they're going to want more. They're going to want more than just just sign here, please. So I think that example of the internal audit being done by a subjective third party, I think we'll see a lot of that in the CMMC space in between the certification audits.
Absolutely.
Remind me on level 3, right? So I can't remember whether or not we already knew what I picked up on, and I didn't remember if I forgot this, that level 3, we knew that it was going to be the 110 controls from 171 plus 24 controls from 172, but now they've specified those 24 controls. Was that done prior to this, or was this new that we saw the new 24 controls?
I believe that the 24 controls were known prior to that,
yeah.
But
Okay.
in kind of speaking to this particular point, the level 3 obviously is for higher profile programs that are handling information that's a little bit above and beyond what a typical CUI might be, right? The missile programs and those types of things.
Weapons, command and
So,
control, right? Yeah.
So this 172 notion,
Communications, right.
it really is the IA part of the CIA triad, right? So the 171, 172 is effectively the 853. And I like the fact that you can see this kind of genesis back to the original DNA, which is really the 853 framework, right? So, 171 is the C part of it, the confidentiality part of it. And they're serious about the IA part, obviously, because of those high value, that high value data and information that you're protecting. But it's beautiful that it all kind of harkens back to the triad and the pyramid at the top there, the 853.
Yeah, and it's NIST setting that record too, because the 172 series, that publication is not going away. So again, it's great that the DOD is letting NIST set the guidance on that, and I think it's important that NIST realizes that there is CUI and there's specified CUI or special CUI. It's good that NIST sees that difference.
Yeah. So we have this guidance. It came out on December 26th. We know there's a 60-day comment period. What then, right? And when does this mean CMMC is actually going to become effective or enforced?
Warren, you got that?
Well, I think, yeah, sure. There's a couple time frames to keep in mind. I mean, so with this one here, we're setting out the CMMC program, and in fact, if you read the final rule and see it, it really lays out, like I said, the original. This is, an introduction to CMMC and what are all the various components going to be and what their roles will be. So it's a full program that in itself is allowing these assessments and these certifications to be awarded. So that's moving ahead after public comments are accepted, and usually it's going to be a 12-month process to review and respond to all these comments. So we can expect sometime in early 2025 for a lot of that to be released, where we'll get another update and it'll just be responding to the comments that they're currently accepting. And then at that point in time, usually when those things are released, when the comments are reviewed and responded to, we have kind of like a 90-day period where we will see that now become like a final notice that this is what everybody needs to be aware of. This is not changing. We're not taking comments anymore. And here's everything that you need to know. So I think as that happens, we're looking at maybe the second quarter of 2025 calendar year for there to actually be this full-on CMMC ecosystem in CFR that says, here's the persons that are going to do the assessments, here's the persons that are going to award certification, here's how an organization, a contractor is going to navigate those things. So really the time frame for that is very straightened out, and at this point it's just a matter of process. I think it's also worth noting that there's another time frame that we're all watching to as well, and that's another revision to CFR 48, and that would be the one that would actually put the contract clause into DFARs and new and renewing contracts after a certain date. So there will be kind of a parallel track here where there'll be a revision that establishes this program and the ability to get assessed and get a certification, and there'll be this revision that'll give contract language to new contracts at a certain point that allows for actually, the requirement for certification. And I think it's important to point those two things out because what we just saw December 26 was the revision to 32 CFR, which is the program. So it's very possible and very similar actually to 80171 and some of the self-assessment activities that we've kind of been in this interim time, contractors having to do, where prime contractors are going to have the ability to tap on a CMMC program, CMMC assessments and certifications before there necessarily is a contract requirement passed down from an official DOD contract. So it's very possible that your prime contractor is going to push you into that faster than you were if you just were directly dealing with the DOD. And we saw that when it came to, again, 80171 self-assessments and having to do the SPRS scores. We had a lot of prime contractors that set deadlines on that and a lot of contractors responding quickly to it. And then it was like at the very end was anybody that had direct business with the DOD, and they said, this is the Monday I have to have this done by. But prime contractors pushed on that as soon as the program, as far as this is how you do a self-assessment, this is where you go to submit a score. As soon as that was available, prime contractors immediately began to push. And I think we see that again too as well. So there will be two revisions to CFR, but I think the one that's currently in, this revision of 32, that's the one that's going to open up the door to an auditor coming into your environment and doing an assessment. And as soon as that one is available, second quarter calendar year 2025, we will see prime contractors start asking their supply chains, when will you schedule this assessment? So that's the time frame that I see, and I think that's the one that's most important.
Absolutely, very well said. I think I could just add one point to that, which is essentially that and kind of reemphasizing is this notion of the flow down, right? And you as a company need to have the situational awareness about where you fit into your supply chain, because if you have dealings with primes or even fairly large subprimes, is that flow down is going to catch you much quicker than a normal these phases are. So those companies that are dealing with primes need to be ready, and they probably are, because my experience is that they've already had questionnaires and they've already had pressure from the primes, because the primes obviously are dealing with, in some instances, tens of thousands of subcontractors, depending on who you are, and they've got to get out ahead of that as well. So they want to make sure that those subcontractors have everything lined up and ready to go as soon as they can, because they're ready to push that flow down requirement. And so that flow down is kind of the catch-all with the folks that think that they can kind of ride this thing out a little bit longer before they have to, to get certified.
So, one of the things you kind of assumed there, right, was that that comment period might extend. So once they address the comments, right, then you're saying it becomes, at that point, within short order, it goes into effect, right? Does that period have to go a year? I mean, could the comment period close in, the end of February, and could we be sitting in June and suddenly they come forward and say, hey, we've addressed all the comments?
I think that you kind of have to look at historical precedent on that. And I think that actually, I don't know if there's going to be any new comments, or I should say, 90% of comments are going to be anything new compared to what's already been discussed in these revisions of 80171.
Well, let's take a step back for a quick second, Warren, right? Because you just, we talked about this earlier. There were no substantial changes really to the requirements, right? And the requirements are the kind of thing where an organization can say, wait a second, we can't afford to do two-factor authentication, or having a SIM for my company is unrealistic. None of those comments are going to exist anymore, right? Because they've already been mediated before, right? Theoretically. So, like, should it take a year to get through comments?
Well, I think that we're talking in kind of the theory and practice, because in theory they shouldn't, but in practice they're going to get the comments again. And so I think what the DoD will have to do is just kind of show that, you know, they're respecting the fact that people have a say in here. And that's how they've done it historically, when it's been the same comment, you know, over and over and over, the same concern over and over, you get the same answer. But I don't think that I could see what you're saying, that they could take a shortcut and just say addressed earlier, see previous answer. But I think that they don't do that because they do want to kind of paint the picture that these comments are taken very serious and listened to and addressed. So I could see how they could do it faster, but I think that it would be unwise to, because it would set it would just set the wrong image that this is not something they're listening to. And they could have already done that previously, and they have not. They've still taken their time. So I would just anticipate, following precedent, they'd take their time again, even though, as we all are in agreement here, that there's nothing really new under the sun when it comes to some of these concerns.
Yeah, and this notion of precedent too is kind of a double-edged sword. You know, if they do not rush, but if they're quick to close that adjudication process, then, you know, what kind of an example are they setting, or precedent are they setting? And we know the government is, you know, they prefer to leverage as much of the time as they're allotted to pretty much any process that they're a part of. So I mean, I think, yes, there's been a lot of clarification in that previous period. There was tons of questions that were answered, but there were some additional questions that kind of did arise with this final rule. Some of which, you know, are pretty impactful. This notion of, you know, potentially log and event vulnerability information being treated as CUI, this notion of external service provider, FedRAMP equivalency versus FedRAMP, you know, ATO. Those types of things will warrant a period where they're going to have to answer and respond to questions. And so, yeah, I think the process historically will play out, as far as the timeline goes, pretty much the way Warren had described it. It will be a pretty decent adjudication period before we get to this final review and approval before they actually publish the final rule in the Federal Register. And that'll be, you know, in 2025.
Gotcha. Okay. So what happens if I'm a OSC, right? Organization seeking certification. What happens between now and the time the rule comes into play? So am I at a point now where I can go to a C3PAO and I can get a CMMC certification, or are there no CMMC certifications until the rule exists, right? Is this a chicken and egg, and what can we do here?
Jeff, I'll let you answer that since you've had some recent experience. Actually,
yeah, so I don't think that the 3PAOs have all of the pieces of the puzzle just yet. I think, especially with some of that language that was introduced, they're going to need some clarification to this. But they're very close. And we know that there'll be this rush to get into the queue when everything is in place. You know, there's just a few pieces of the puzzle left, but there will be this mad rush to get into the queue. And, you know, we all feel like, with the tens of thousands of defense contractors that are, you know, going to be required to certify, and a limited number of these assessing organizations, that it's going to be that those queues are going to fill up very quickly. So I think people are going to want to have those conversations very soon, and they could even be having those conversations right now. But I do not believe that the assessing organizations have everything that they need, so they're going to wait for some clarification on this as well. But that's not to say that there are not other tools available to them or to companies to get, you know, incremental steps towards that. And one of them is you can still do 800-171 gap assessments. We know that 800-171 is, you know, is the core of the program. And so you can get an assessment and essentially a picture of where you stand with a bulk of the program with this gap assessment. And those assessing organizations are going to give you some credit for that. They're not going to just point blank with the CMMC assessment give you 100% credit on that, but they will have gone through the process of review and looking at artifacts and things like that, and it'll be a much less intense touch point for them to get beyond that, and then to look at the gap between the 800-171 type of an assessment to the CMMC assessment. So that is one of the tools that's kind of in the assessing organization's kind of toolkit now, to get some people a picture of where they stand, something that they that these companies can take to their up their chain to their boards to tell them, yes, we're serious about this, and we're actually we're making progress, but not everything is there just yet. So I think we'll have to wait until this comment period is closed out, and at least some type of hint at the answer to some of these important questions that are still out there before the assessing organizations are going to get serious about saying, yeah, we can schedule you on such and such a date and actually conduct the assessment.
So quick question for you. We just had a client go through a quote unquote CMMC assessment. I know it wasn't an official one, right? But we had a C3PAO come in and do that. What was that called?
It was just.
What did they call that? And what did they get?
It was a NIST 800-171 gap assessment. So it was an assessment against all those controls.
Okay. So it's basically an 800-171A. Yeah. So and it was an 800-171A assessment, which is effectively CMMC.
It's the bulk of the program. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Good. All right. Good. All right. Good. All right.
Don, I just wanted to add that.
So that would be.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the thing too that I think is sound advice now is tying back to your point about this new focus on the interim time period between the 3-year certification assessments. If you are thinking, well, we're not getting a C3PAO assessment this year, then you should ask the question of what evidence does our CIO or CISO need to see in order to sign off for a self-assessment and an internal audit. And that's something that you're not waiting on anybody to tell you what that is. That's something that you as an organization need to define now. And so if you want to hold off until 25 to look at the C3PAO involvement, okay, understandable. But at the same time, you should be able to answer the question sooner than later about what is your own internal threshold needed of evidence. That way you would be comfortable signing one of those things annually. And so if you're not going to involve the external C3PAO, then you should at a minimum be looking at what your own internal standard of evidence would be for your own assessment that you'd have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. In the document, they had a kind of a table with 4 phases, which I thought was interesting. And the start date is the date CMMC revisions to the DFARs become effective. So that is, we're anticipating that's when the comment period closes, this CFR 32 goes into effect, right? So you're talking about, let's say that for sake of argument, that's January of 2025, right? So right away, then on that date, this level 2 self-assessment requirement goes into all solicitations, right? And then 6 months later, right, then you get the third-party C3PAO assessments for level 2 go into effect. And then a year later is when we see the CMMC level 3 stuff come into play. So I thought that was kind of interesting and I guess good in terms of because it's going to be. I don't think we have enough guidance yet to really know exactly what the level 3 stuff is. Well, I guess we do, right? Because do we have the assessment criteria for we have a 172A document.
172A, yeah, I was going to say.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're good there. All right, so that's just the timeline, right? So I think we can agree that many companies that we deal with or talk with have waited until they knew CMMC was definitively going to happen, right? I mean, I've probably had 36 conversations with someone saying like, well, when I'm sure it's going to happen, we'll make the investment, but not until then. You never know with the government. In your mind, have we hit definitive?
Absolutely.
Yep, 100%. We're there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that time with the final rule that we have and the idea of this is the CMMC ecosystem, the CMMC policy, I think that's what those people really need to open up and read if they were thinking they were waiting for something more final.
Okay. And I think there's a general consensus that for an average organization, it's going to take somewhere between 9 and 18 months to not have a fire drill, to put in place a CMMC or 80171 conforming management program. So, from that perspective as well, we've sort of hit, now not only is it definitive, but if we don't start now, you will be behind the eight ball come, January 2025.
Yeah, I think we're into that time of risk of losing out on contract opportunities is a real risk that you have to consider and be aware of.
I mentioned that we just went through that 80171 assessment with our client. Any lessons learned?
Yeah, scope is very important when it comes to that. Understanding scope, and a large portion of the initial discussion and assessment process is centered around identifying scope. They take the system security plan and what you've described as scope, but they almost have a high level, very quick rundown of the same scope assessment methodology to understand in their words what the scope is. And they do harp and they hyper focus on the boundary if you're talking enclave and scope and ensuring the controls that are at that boundary. They really want to understand if CUI can traverse that boundary, and if it does, then they look at again your scope and to make sure that you've properly defined it. And so you want to make sure that is clearly defined and rock solid, because a large portion of the demonstrations were to demonstrate that you can't do certain things, or you can do things. Or that you're doing things that you say you're doing when it comes to that boundary, and that was the key takeaway. The other things, again, we live in that 80171 world. We've been in that world for many years, so there's lots of controls that are fairly black and white and fairly well understood. But this notion of enclave, that is meant to give you a smaller footprint and somewhat of a less of a lift when it comes to being compliant, is a key element that they want to make sure that you've defined properly. So I think that was the key takeaway, is that you have to ensure that boundary is very solid.
So almost in a weird way, like or either a deconstructive or almost like they hacked the SSP, if you will, right? Is they weren't just looking at the SSP and saying, okay, like taking a forward basis look at it, almost looking at it from the other side and saying, can I figure out where
right.
you
Exactly.
messed this up?
Yeah.
Interesting. How far did they drill into the supply chain, right? So, I know the client a bit, having done some of the ISO 27001 SOC 2 work there years ago. I know they have an MSP that's involved in some of their stuff. I know they're in the cloud. I don't know if they're relevant to this particular SSP. How far did they go down? Did they, into the CSPs, the ESPs, the security providers?
So there was, I guess, a level of, they did give them, I guess, some credit for the fact that this was already in a FedRAMP, high, GCC high enclave. Or GCC high environment. So they did ask for, and they looked at the latest FedRAMP attestation that Microsoft had. They did, again, back to the scope and the interconnection, system interconnections. They did drill down through that and made sure that that was clearly defined. And in those instances where there was a third party, in their situation, it was a SIM. They looked very, very closely at that offering as well, and they asked for multiple demonstrations that the things that they say that were being done by this third party was actually being done, and that you could provide evidence as such. So reports. They wanted to see current reports. They wanted to see current logs with activity and things like that. So it was very thorough, but only in the sense of just that interconnection kind of piece. And again, some credit was given for some of the big, like a cloud service provider that's a Microsoft or Amazon, I would imagine, AWS, GovCloud, they would give some credit for. Yeah.
Makes complete sense. I think we beat this up pretty good in terms of what we had chatted about. Anything we missed? Any last thoughts that you guys want to share?
Jeff?
Yeah, so my takeaway is that just based on some of the questions that have popped, and this notion of external service provider, and then leading up to the final rule, last year, I think a theme that I'm taking away is that they're taking third-party risk much more seriously, in as much as you have managed service providers or managed security service providers or other third-party relationships that may have some type of connectivity into your system, and they are focused on making sure that you have assessed the risk of those interconnections, and they're doing that through this ESP kind of nomenclature, and they've called that out as specific in addition to a cloud service provider. And they're looking at solution stacks that these service providers have. So, let me roll back.
Bravo.
So what I was saying is, I think my takeaway is that they're very focused on third-party risk, right? Which we know is made headlines in recent years. Third-party risk was essentially what almost brought down Maersk, and I can attest to that personally as a part of that. Mm-hmm. So when you look at external service provider, and then this notion of what the solution stack is, is it are they leveraging tools that are in your enclave, or are they leveraging tools that's part of their solution stack or outside of your control? They're very much concerned about that risk, and that want to understand that you understand the risk and that you've quantified it. And they're doing that, and they're looking at that through this notion of ESP and bringing into light that they have to be L2 certified as well if they're storing, processing, or transmitting information that they're going to define as CUI. And I think that does harken back to this idea that, if you don't have a good picture of your third-party risk, you can have all of these wonderful controls in a very well-defined and mature program, and you have somebody who does something, very bad, or has a bad moment on a third-party side, and they can bring everything down.
Mr. Hylton, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that was well put, because I think that is something that's getting a lot of attention right now, and has been a lot of conversations about, and I'm glad to see clarity on these third parties and how that supply chain is brought into these assessments. But I think for my final thoughts here today is just kind of go back to my soapbox, which is that in part of working through all of this is I get to know defense contractors, I get to know decision makers and leaders within defense contractors. And I feel like there's a lot of gratitude and thanks to be given out to people that have taken this seriously, been proactive, considered the risks that they face being in this space and being in this market. And unfortunately, I see a lot of other folks too that do not. It's just this market is just another one to go into and win. And I think that is unfortunately short-sighted, and it misses the point of what this market actually is to serve and U.S. national interests. So I think a big thank you to everybody. I feel at the end here, it's kind of that time where you say, thanks to everybody that got us to here. And it was the contractors that took this seriously, understanding their risk and the market that they served, and sort of the higher picture, bigger picture of what they are part of, that we really owe a big gratitude to. If you are on the other side of that and you see this as just a dollars and cents thing, I mean, there's a lot of dollar values in this final rule as far as how much this may cost and how much this should be and all that. And if that's what's most important to you, again, I just would challenge you to think about the space that you operate in and the customer that you serve. And if you will not do that, then you will have competition that does. So it's here at the end of everything. I just feel like it's the time to say thank you to the contractors and the decision makers within contractors that took this seriously, understood that there was a problem here. And even though the solution and sort of how we solve this problem is an ongoing battle that has had its highs and had its lows, anybody who understood that the problem was the problem and didn't second guess that, I say thank you to those individuals and those companies. Very important that there was this critical mass, and I do see it now in a way that I did not see it as clearly 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think we're very fortunate at Pivot Point to work with a lot of clients that recognize that winning in the 2020s does equal strong security. Stephen Covey Jr. wrote a book that I like, The Speed of Trust, I think it was called. And in the book, he talks about trust being a lubricant, right? It makes actions happen with less friction and quicker. And I think if you understand that about information security, if you can lean into an information security conversation instead of away from it, if you have attestations to prove to a concerned third-party regulator, client, etc., that you are secure and compliant, I think that you are going to win.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Kudos to those that are a little bit more forward-thinking. Guys, this has been awesome. I appreciate you guys jumping on. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you guys, what's the easiest way to do that? They had a question?
Go ahead, Warren.
Oh, I like to give my email, warren.hylton, Hylton, at Pivot Point Security. I'm always available there, and love to get to know you and your questions.
Yep, and Jeffrey Carden, Jeffrey.Carden at pivotpointsecurity.com, and I'm up on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sean.